to be with all of you today. I'm going to share my screen with you, if that's okay, and just make sure everybody can see it here. Okay. Move this here so I can see. Can you see that? Sorry. Okay, all set. So the title of this session is Brain Matters. And I prepared this after having a conversation with Sebastian about some of the work that Girl Security is doing around wargaming to serve the needs of different types of learners in our program. So I just want to thank Sebastian for being a huge champion of Girl Security and providing a space to have a conversation around a topic that feels very important to us at Girl Security. I also just wanted to note the cover image. This is actually an image from a war game, actually our first war game that we conducted in 2019. And that war game was developed by Becca Wasser, Stacy Pettyjohn, Ellie Bartels, and Jenny Oberholzer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that particular war game and sort of the implications that it had for Girl Security as an organization, but also for kind of the scope of work that we do around wargaming. So a few points, I feel like it's important to say who I am and who I am not. So my name is Lauren Buitta. I'm the founder and CEO of Girl Security. I'm the daughter of and sister to mental health professionals, which means that I spent a lot of my youth talking about why people behave in certain ways and doing a lot of work understanding my own behaviors. I'm also someone who has experienced trauma, so a lot of the work that I've done myself has informed a lot of the work that we do with Girl Security. Last year in April, my mentor died. He was a divergent thinker, and I have that word in quotes because we're going to talk a bit about kind of just the verbiage around neurodiversity and some related topics. I'm someone who sees the value in wargaming for different purposes and different communities, and someone who values fostering a sense of belonging and inclusion. Most importantly, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a scientist of any kind. I'm not a war gamer, I'm not a scholar, and I'm not a current or former military. So I want to just be very clear about who I am and who I am not as we kind of get into a conversation around these topics. And the conversation is somewhat chronological, which I think is helpful to understanding why at Girl Security we first of all began wargaming, using war games with adolescent girls, but then also kind of again how as we've learned about different needs of our community, we've continued to try to refine and understand different approaches to make sure that all of our programming, as well as just our organizational design, creates a sense of belonging for anyone who wants to participate in the national security space. So just a sequence of the conversation. So we'll talk a little bit about Girl Security. We'll talk a little bit about why wargaming. I will flag some what I call instructional moments, which are, again, kind of moments that have directed the scope of work that we're advancing in Girl Security, not just around wargaming, but broadly. I'll also talk about the role of trauma in Girl Security programming. As I noted, all of our work is trauma informed, and so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And then we'll kind of explore neurodiversity because the field and the conversation around it is quite nuanced. And so I just want to take a moment of reflection where we can consider what the different words mean and kind of how the field is changing and where the conversation is now. And then some lessons and learning goals. So again, I want to be very clear that I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who runs an organization that serves girls and women and gender minorities with very different needs. And so I can only speak from the perspective of the work that we've done. I don't want any of this to sound as though I'm projecting or directing. I just thought really this is an opportunity to share some of the learnings that we've built around this space, specifically around inclusion and neurodiversity. And so I just had a question that you don't need to respond necessarily in the chat. please do if you feel comfortable. But if there's kind of any immediate associations or ideas that you associate with the word inclusion, I feel like kind of diversity, equity, inclusion, I know is a huge part of the work that we do at Girl Security. And I just wondered how that kind of landed with some of you on the call today. Yeah, awareness, I think, is really crucial. It's a big part of it. So as I mentioned, Girl Security is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. The way that we define it is forging equity and national security by advancing girls, women, and gender minorities through supportive pathways. I dropped our website as well in our social media, as well as a hashtag that we use, which is equitable pathways, equitable policies. So at Girl Security, we're focused on increasing the representation of women and national security across government and industry, but we also believe that increased representation can actually help shape more equitable national security policies, as well as just ideals and norms around kind of the importance of inclusion in national security. So there's kind of three primary organizational components. We have a mentor network, which is really, I think, the core of the work that we do. It was part of a very strong foundation of the organization. We have mentors from across the country who commit to 6 months with a girl or woman interested in national security pathways. Our mentees are 14 up. So we have a lot of mentees that stay in the program up until their early to mid 20s, which is really wonderful, actually, because we really kind of want to foster a community of mentorship, so that as young people pursue their pathways and advance forward, they have the support of a community that wants to see them succeed in this space. We also have a stipended fellowship. We have a Girl Security National Security Fellows program. So this is a program designed for 15 to 19-year-olds, and it's very much like an apprentice program where they work with us over the course of 6 months and participate in skill building and professional development and other types of work. They also create a capstone project, as well as a draft national security strategy. And so just to kind of give you a sense of what some of the fellows are envisioning for their capstone, there's 3/4 of the fellows are first generation immigrant students. So many of them are focused on how identity can shape national security. They're focused on gender-based violence and domestic terrorism, climate change, cybersecurity, disinformation, the role of diplomacy. It's a pretty broad scope of issues that they're focused on. And then we also have an in-school learning program. So we actually offer both customized learning programs for high schools, as well as we've just created a 1-week kind of like national security in a box curriculum for high schools as well, who are really eager to learn more about national security, but just don't have access to that learning. And then I would say on top of that, we do a lot of kind of public facing programming for girls and women to get exposure to things like wargaming or other kind of skills-based or learning opportunities in a supportive environment. And I think what's so foundational to the work that we do and why this conversation feels very important to me and our organization is identity plays a really foundational role in our work at Girl Security, because our mission is premised upon the belief that every individual brings a unique perspective to our national security, and that sort of the aggregate of those perspectives can transform national security decision making. And we kind of just feel as though national security is the most important common cause. So there's no reason why someone should not feel that they belong or are valued in a space like national security. I will just do a bit about, I'm happy to stop and answer questions if anyone has questions about the model or anything like that. And Lexi, I can't see the chat, I apologize, but if there are any questions at this point, I'm happy to take them before getting into the next slide.
I think we are ready for this next slide typed.
Okay.
Wargaming, yeah.
Oh, here we go. So I think the why wargaming is a question I often get, given that our organization serves, at least at a starting point, girls ages 14 plus. So I put a couple of screenshots of an article from 2006, quoting my brother, who was a first lieutenant in the Army and was deployed to Iraq. And what was so funny about this newspaper article was that they had actually interviewed me in a separate essay, because my brother and I wrote physical letters back and forth. And, there was kind of this nostalgia to the idea of that. They ended up publishing both articles the same day, not knowing that the two of us were brother and sister. And so my initial interest in wargaming was really prompted by the experience that my family had, having someone deployed 2 tours in Iraq and then stop lost. And his deployment, I think more generally in deployments, have a really significant impact on families. And what I kind of saw my mom go through over the course of several years was quite significant. So from my perspective, for wargaming and being as close as I was to my brother, when I first started to kind of learn about wargaming, I just really thought of it from a personal perspective of, boy, it would be really cool to have an understanding of the types of decisions that Brett was making when he was deployed. I think it's kind of a natural and, intuitive to want to kind of connect around a shared experience with someone you love. And when they're deployed, you don't have that connectivity. On top of that, he couldn't tell us where he was and the types of things he was doing. So in my mind, the idea for wargaming really was just this idea of, boy, I think for military families, especially children or siblings at a younger age, giving them exposure to a war game and kind of just putting them in the shoes of someone they love could be quite a cool experience. And I think there's still an opportunity if that isn't being done. And then just by chance, I started reading about wargaming. I thought a lot about the experiences that I had as, again, kind of during the wars in Iraq, and I was working for a national security think tank, and there was a lot of public disengagement around the wars. And, it just kind of continued to wash over me over the years about how divisive war is and how black and white the conversation is and how complicated war is, and decisions around war are really a hope for the public to understand more about what that decision making looks like. And so I actually read an article by Sebastian in 2018, which I cut the screenshot down there, just let them compete, raising the next generation of wargamers. And I thought it was a really cool kind of inspired approach. Wargaming felt really exclusive to me when I was reading about it several years ago, and Sebastian's piece kind of, I think, opened up the space, at least from my perspective as a non-wargamer, to feel like, boy, maybe this is something that we can be doing for young people to give them exposure to strategy and operations and planning and logistics and things like that. So I actually reached out to Sebastian, who connected me with the quote unquote dames of wargaming. Actually, he connected me with Abby Dahl, who I spoke with first, and kind of pitched this idea of, hey, I want to run a war game for girls and women as an opportunity to maybe learn about something that they might not otherwise learn about, and really have this kind of positive and supportive experience that could kind of be empowering to them throughout the rest of their career or pathways in national security and related fields. Because I knew, having worked with girls, that there was a strong, I wouldn't say tendency against defense or military or whatever, however you want to categorize it. But I think generally speaking, most of the girls in our program were more interested in diplomacy and human rights and things like that. But I felt as though if they had this experience of the game, that could really help shape their understanding, regardless of their career paths. And I think it was really a great opportunity to kind of demystify war and the like for them as part of this experience. And then, as noted, the idea of creating a shared experience for young people and any people, really. Girl Security is working with adolescents. So we kind of see ourselves as hopefully an organization that can provide insights to higher level national security organizations, whether it's the military, whether it's other government agencies, whether it's private industry, to say, hey, here are some of the challenges that we're seeing in a learning environment for young people interested in national security pathways. Let's think about, maybe I wouldn't necessarily call it early intervention, but let's think about some frameworks that we can put in place to ensure that they can thrive later on in their pathways. So that was really the genesis for the first war game we did. And as you can see, we got quite a bit of interesting feedback. Mostly it was positive. NPR covered the game. I don't know if I do it all over again, if we would have had that happen, but there it is, it was out there. So we were trolled pretty hard on social media by a couple of people. I put a quote on the right-hand side, a particularly brazen example of imperialist feminism targeted at young women and girls under the guise of girl power. Girl security is militarizing schools. And even today, actually, any of our tweets that talk about wargaming, they're flagged as having sensitive content. Yeah, so Michelle, I see your comment in there. Absolutely. That's a big conversation that we have around, is even just using the phrase wargaming. On the one hand, we don't want to diminish the fact that this is a field and there is a pipeline and it is a discipline. On the other hand, it would be naive to assume that, yeah, exactly. Oh, hi, Vocal. So nice to see you. So we've started using things like, conflict de-escalation, conflict simulations, things like that to make it more comfortable. I think what's so challenging about that reality is the idea that we have girls in our program who are 18 in the Army and they're going to do war games, right? So we don't want to diminish the value of what they'll be participating in, yet we also need to be sensitive to the realities that you note in the chat, which is just the verbiage and the language around a war game. So this was an operational war game. It was hosted at RAND. We had 14 girls and women from across the US. And I suppose for the reasons I noted above, of my lens through this was very much, connecting to an experience, demystifying some of the nuance, providing this really exciting learning and training experience, educational experience, and a shared space that was supportive. So even though we did get some backlash, it was positive. It was mostly all positive. And in fact, the participants themselves, said it was transformative. It completely changed the trajectory of their careers. Even for girls who were interested in human rights or human conflict, it provided them with a different lens through which they were seeing their own interests and work. We had survey feedback of 99%. The 1% was that they wanted another day, which I always thought that was quite wonderful. But we had an exchange during that program that kind of gets us to the next framework that leads to kind of where we are in thinking about neurodiversity and accessibility, which was one of the participants was in the Army. And at one point I saw her sitting off to the side during the game. Is that what your participants hoped? Yeah, I mean, so that's the idea, right, Tim, is the idea behind it was one of the key outcomes was realizing how sometimes, first of all, there are hard decisions that may not have any good outcomes, but also using wargaming as a tool to understand how to mitigate or test, worst case scenarios and avoid some of those outcomes as part of this learning experience. But as I was saying, one of the participants was in the Army and she was kind of just looking over the board, and I just said, "Hey, what's going on?" And she said, I might be one of these game board pieces, someday. And on the one hand, I'm kind of reassured to understand how I fit within the context of this kind of operational setting. And I understand that I'm part of something larger, but then there's also this part of me that, is afraid, is kind of afraid of the reality of what this game is representing to me. And then separately, we had another participant whose family was actually in South Korea. So this game was, a potential conflict, a rising conflict in North Korea. And she kind of just started playing out, what would happen to my family if conflict actually escalates and with North Korea, and, how might that change my own trajectory for my career? And through conversations that came out of that, we started doing a lot of work in what is kind of called a trauma-informed approach. So that same person in the Army also had subsequently already been assaulted as part of her time in the Army, and as noted on the slide here, we know now, and this is not something that's new to girl security. This is a conversation that we have often, but we really felt that it was really responsible for us to start employing what's called a trauma-informed approach. And I just had some statistics on the left-hand side around, just women and girls' exposure to attempted rape or sexual assault, not just in the military, out of the military, just broader society. So trauma-informed is integrating the understanding of trauma throughout an organization, program, or system to enhance the quality, effectiveness, and delivery of services provided to individuals and groups. It also assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma. And so that work is really important to us, not only because of the statistics around sexual assault, but also girls and women in our program are experiencing a totally different social environment pre and now post-pandemic and social media. And the actual neuroscience is still out on the impacts. And I know the Wall Street Journal piece got a lot of traction, and it is important to understand what the potential implications are of technology on cognition and technology on socialization. And in fact, the most solid evidence to date actually studies teen girls' brains, but it's not, the data is not fully there. But anyways, we really started to do a lot of work on the trauma-informed approach just to make sure that whether it's the two participants at the Wargame, or whether it's someone on a webinar, or whether it's someone at one of our kind of specialized in-school programming, that they felt supported in this space. And so kind of how does that actually translate to work as it pertains to either a setting for a war game or any of the other work that we do? First of all, the impacts of trauma can include anxiety, depression, avoidance, outbursts, hypervigilance, which I would kind of asterisk is one of the more common issues that we see. And so really what trauma approach means is that you kind of just integrate a mindfulness about, as noted, the fact that individuals might bring trauma into a space and creating what's called a trauma sensitive and learning environment. So it sounds common sense, and maybe it is nowadays. We're not physically together, but once we are, no touching anyone, kind of, I do that myself sometimes. I, put my hand on someone or something like that. And that's really, it could be a very triggering for someone in a space like that. Allowing for space and movement. So if you're around a game board, making sure that everyone is mindful of each other's space, verbalizing expectations and sequencing, which kind of goes to that hypervigilance. Having experienced trauma myself, as I noted, oftentimes, well, for a long time, I really couldn't even stand in front of a room full of people. And I always kind of had to know where exits were and things like that. So making sure that you kind of create that expectation of here's what's going to happen over the course of the next 2 to 3 hours or over the course of the day, so that everyone has an understanding of sequencing, allowing time for reflection. So even when we do hot washes, making sure that everyone has time to really process their thoughts, and then also verbalizing support and creating a means for communication and feedback. So we oftentimes, both before and after programmings, we'll check in with people and say, hey, is there anything else we can do to make sure that you feel supported as part of this learning experience? And, you get all kinds of random feedback, but I think it's all really good feedback that, will amplify this person's learning experience as part of this really thoughtful, program that you might be putting on, and kind of hope for the best with respect to some of those experiences. So kind of relatedly, I'm giving a lot of I feel like it's a lot of psych and frameworks, but we, as we kind of have done this work and we've done more programming and we're kind of seeing the experiences of young people, we really were kind of thinking, all right, we have this trauma-informed approach, which has these kind of universal principles that actually play out in the kind of neurodiversity space. There's this common core of best practices for creating a learning environment that enables accessibility and inclusion. And I'm just noting the next kind of framework that we employ, which is called social and emotional learning. And it's a process through which young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and actually ethical and caring decisions. So again, kind of this is this instructional moment and why we continue to kind of advance this model in our work. We work with girls and women from diverse communities across the US. We work with a lot of communities that are under-resourced, and girls from these communities bring a lot of trauma to our program. And it comes out, you know, even in the context of a simulation or tabletop, you know, typically girls want to have a personal connection to the work. And so they will find those connections. And so as an organization serving them, we really need to make sure that we have the frameworks in place to support whatever their learning experience is. So the SEL frameworks have really been supported by a lot of evidence by an organization called CASTLE, which if you're interested in either the trauma-informed approach or SEL, all of this is, I can send out the links, but I've noted the resources here. All of these have a lot of evidence and data backing why they've been effective and are even more effective now. And I would just kind of footnote this number on the bottom of 96% of teachers saying that kids need this kind of support. You know, neuroscientists are speculating or studying how much this has to do with reliance on technology, impact on brain matter, cognition, recall, application, socialization. There's all of these areas that are really rapidly evolving, and our position as an organization is let's just get the frameworks in place while the neuroscientists drill down the science, so that at least we know that we kind of can support the people coming through our program. And so these are just similarly some practices that you can employ in the classroom, like the trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive environment. These are not rocket science, right? My sister, who's I mentioned, is a mental health professional. She's on our board. She works with adolescents. You know, I'm like, how do you define trauma-informed? She's like, just don't be a jerk, which is essentially kind of what it is. You know, communicating norms of a cooperative learning environment, verbalizing one's own thought process to model problem solving. This one is really great, not just for the neurodiversity piece, but, you know, if you're working with young people who may not have had access to the same type of learning opportunities, kind of modeling your own problem solving can be really helpful. So we do that a lot in Wargaming to build confidence of girls and women in our program. Again, providing sufficient time for participants to process information, asking open-ended questions, right? Again, just creating that supportive environment for their work, providing pre-readings and pre-teaching definitions and concepts. This is also really important for the kind of, you know, making sure that students who are different types of learners have the support that they need going into a war game or any other type of simulation. Creating that kind of safe risk-taking environment. And I just gave a kind of an example of a question of let's hear from a couple of people who can challenge my idea. So letting people know who may lack confidence, whether it's because, you know, they're autistic or they've suffered abuse or they have not had access to, yeah, I'm happy to send it, to send the link as well. All of these frameworks kind of have this universal application. And I think it just sends a message to people that you're aware of their experience, you're taking it into account, and you're trying to ensure that they feel included in any given particular activity. So this is a little bit of like I don't know if it's a mind map, but it kind of sets up how we kind of got to the neurodiversity. Wargaming usually implies competition. How does that work with social and mental? Yeah, I think it is okay to lose. And I think that's exactly right, Tim, is kind of when you have some of those tools in place where either you're verbalizing and kind of modeling through your own critical thinking and or creating a collaborative environment when you're allowing for reflection among your peers and then coming together as a collaborative group. It's not necessarily that someone who suffered trauma would necessarily, you know, have a different reaction than anybody else. I think really it's just creating that space for feedback. Now, that might be different for different populations, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I think generally speaking, the aspect of competition doesn't change the algorithm for kind of what provides a safe learning environment. So as I noted around technology and cognition, that was kind of what got us going on a lot of these different thoughts was, all right, we're hearing all of this stuff about the impact of technology on girls. The science isn't there. We'll use the trauma-informed approach because we know a lot of girls come into our program with trauma. We're going to use the social emotional learning because it's a really great framework that's really accessible by a lot of different people. What else can we be doing? And that was when there was kind of this other instructional moment, which is that just, I would say 6 or 7 months ago, we did a war game with about 90 girls. And I was in a breakout room with 15, and over half self-identified as neurodiverse. We weren't talking about identity. We weren't sharing anything personal. We were kind of just going through the first move and kind of just, figuring out what we might suggest to the team of wargamers. And I was really struck by that because we were doing work in the area of understanding kind of, again, these different frameworks for supporting different types of learners, but they started to share more about their experiences. And these are all girls and women who are on a path into the services as well. I want to protect the confidentiality of the group. So this is, a cohort of 90 people, and just in my breakout room alone have had this experience. And I just kept thinking to myself, boy, they're going to advance into the military where, they may likely be doing more of these war games. We have not set them up for success in this game, to be quite honest. And it really just struck me because it, in a way, felt like a personal failure, but then I just knew that we had to be doing more to make sure that they felt supported. And so we started to get some feedback from them about what would be helpful to support their learning experience as part of the war game. And they gave us some of those kind of tips that I was sharing out around pre-readings, pre-teaching, allowing moments for reflection. In fact, allowing moments to talk about their identities, to be able to share, hey, I'm autistic, or hey, I have ADHD, which many of them shared that they had, this is going to be challenging for me. So even just making a space for them to do that was actually quite impactful. So as noted, Vocal, there's the language around neurodiversity is really, it's a very active language. And I tried to do my best to represent what I think are actually wonderful different categorizations of neurodiversity. And these are a couple of the two top quotes. Steve Silverman, author of Neurotribes, and Janara Nuremberg, author of Divergent Mind, share this same idea, which neurodiversity is the notion that conditions like autism, dyslexia, that's an edit there, ADHD, should be regarded as naturally occurring cognitive variations with distinctive strengths. Neurodiversity is a framework that embraces the variety of the brain makeups found in the human species. Neurodiverse refers to the actual individual with a neurodevelopmental difference. And then, there's a note from this doctor at the bottom of Neuroqueer, which is an awesome website that really just lays out the language of neurodiversity and saying there's no such thing as forms of neurodiversity. There's forms of neurodivergence. So you can kind of see like neurodiversity, neurodiverse, neurodivergent. And I really, I really support the idea of serving communities' needs. So if you're working with girls and young women and they're sharing this information with you and you're responsible for their learning experience and how to scaffold a particular experience for their benefit, then a field like neurodiversity, I think, can be quite welcoming because they're really struggling to advance in these spaces with whatever their particular cognitive variation is. And I think I chose the phrase cognitive variation. I just think that makes sense to me. Later on, I think I've used human operating system, which is how the author of Neurotribes talks about it, which is essentially we shouldn't think of these things as deficits or disorders. which is what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5. I mean, the whole basis of the DSM is that everything is, defined as a disorder. So, you kind of have this field that's saying, hey, let's not consider these things to be disorders. Let's just consider them to be cognitive differences, because guess what? The science is catching up, and lots of it is really just, we're kind of just finding the language around it. Yeah, it is just a new term. Absolutely. And so I read about, started reading about neurodiversity, and I have, 2 children, and I kind of was thinking about how do we create supportive learning environments. And I came across this article that the Israeli Army had put in place, which is the Rahim Rashak program, and which is basically a program that trains autistic teens in different aspects of intelligence analysis, or OSINT, or essentially tries to find where their strengths are and provides both the training and learning piece, but also the kind of socialization piece, like a pipeline, so that they kind of participate in their military service and then are able to be directed to opportunities in the private sector. And I did, talk to a couple of people who work on that program, just around kind of what was working and what wasn't, for the purposes of how we can kind of best support the people in our program. And I'll share shortly what we were directed to. But I think, to Michelle's point, it's a new movement. It's kind of a paradigm around different variations of cognition, but and as I said, it's this kind of active dialogue around, okay, what does neurodiversity actually mean at work in different spaces? And so now a lot of companies kind of have either like autism at work or neurodiversity at work programs that provide similar types of learning, training, and socialization opportunities for young people, adults as well. So I just wanted to share, this was my mentor, Al. He was autistic, and he died in April. And so when I first met Al, first of all, he was almost the oldest person to climb Everest. That's a picture of Al. He was just killer. He was just an amazing person. I shared on the right-hand side, this was one of his memos. So Al would box, he would box and bold everything. He would box, bold, highlight, do all of these things. He would, revisit drafts 300, 400, 500 times. He had running lists of different quotations, one of which I highlighted because it was one of my favorites, which was "Even cowboys dress for dinner." I think it's always like just the most brilliant quote that seems to make sense in every situation. But working with him for almost a decade, I recognized how challenging it was for him to not only be taken seriously in his work. He was brilliant. I mean, he was so grounded in data and numbers that so many of the quote unquote predictions he made as part of the work that we did on racial segregation in Chicago were so prescient at the time. And now all of these things are kind of coming to fruition in the city as he was interpreting them. But I worked with him for over a decade, as I said, and I learned a lot about how he worked with others. And he, as part of his climbing, I always think of this story because I think it's a beautiful story, but it's also a story about what his experiences were from a social experience. Was he would create these really extraordinary opportunities for young people. He was self-made. He kind of made his money in mortgage brokering, and he would take 10 guys they call the goon squad, or 20 people, and host a party, take them climbing on Mount McKinley, take them to the opera in Russia, whatever it was. He would sit back and not socialize. He would just sit in the back and watch everyone kind of have fun. And I saw him do this so many times over the years. And also just in our time working together, he would see me, of course, I would have a difficulty or something would happen. And his attempts to quote unquote empathize, I learned a lot about what his thought process was, and I just observed him a lot in his universe with the work that he did. And I just thought this quote from Steve Silberman was so great, which is, we have to think more intelligently about people who think differently. And I think that is such an important quote for this kind of work, especially. So I just wanted to share a little bit about Al because he was such an amazing mentor to me, and he did exceptional work. And I oftentimes feel that so much of what he did just was overlooked because of how he communicated with others as well. So again, part of the other challenge is, I wanted to add one point. This came up also during one of our war games was someone used the word empathy, and that kind of set in motion a conversation about whether someone, who has a whether they're autistic or have ADHD or whatever it might be, whether they can actually express empathy. And I think certainly for Al and others that we've talked to about this, there's the difference of kind of cognitive empathy, which is, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, or affective empathy, which is kind of when you have an emotional response to someone else, to an event. And I noticed this, I experienced this a lot with Al, this kind of time lag response where he would see me having a reaction, or he would see someone else have an experience, and he might not express the emotion that someone else might have, but he was trying to understand your experience, and he was expressing emotion. And so we've talked a lot about that as well as part of our program. And I think it plays into wargaming, where you might be reading people's, or we've seen this in our program, again, at least with adolescents, you might be reading people's social cues. And if they don't exhibit the same social cues that you've identified or socialized, finding out ways to create those communication channels, I think it could be quite important, and is very much important for us. So then, just as I noted, a lot of girls in our program self-identifying, and a lot of them also shared, and I knew this from some of the work that we've done previously at Girl Security, but the behaviors tend to exhibit later in girls and women, although it's not that they exhibit later, it's just they're exhibiting different types of behaviors that may not be diagnosed, so resulting in a later stage diagnosis. So there's, quite a bit of research on kind of how ADHD and other other kind of variations represent in girls and women. And, because of a lag in science, because of a lag in diagnoses, girls will either develop masking strategies, which girls in our program have shared a lot about, basically I just mimic behaviors, but also talk about how, the adverse impacts on their self-esteem, their academic performance, and their socialization as well. So all of that really kind of brought us to a place. How do you balance between professional or self-diagnosis? Oh gosh, I'm not a big person on self-diagnosis, only because I feel as though, if you can find a trusted person, which I think is always the best bet, and you find someone who you trust to kind of work with you on what your concerns or symptoms or behaviors or whatever it might be, I would say professional might be it. But I definitely think it's worth, I think what we're realizing is that we all think differently, and most of us have had trauma, which we already know rewires the brain, and that we have to then kind of work to rewire it. So I think anytime we can stop and reflect on ourselves and our own behavior, at least that's a lot of the work that we do at Girl Security, there's always tools and frameworks available. And I think that's what I really appreciate about the work that we've been doing with social workers and mental health professionals in this space. I do, and I'm going to get to that actually, Volko. I actually really do think, and that's really where we're going in that direction with Girl Security. We're going to be doing a lot of work over the next 6 months to 12 months on this. I wanted to flag that, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency has kind of launched this neurodiversity pilot that kind of, again, to your point, Volko, actually taps into the talents of neurodiverse people and creates pathways, because part of that's right, Michelle. It's antiquated ideas. Yeah. And as you said, being your advocate is also really, really crucial. And that's what we've been hearing a lot of from girls, again, who might be exhibiting different behaviors. And if they don't have a parent who is able to advocate, it can be quite challenging for them to self-advocate. Absolutely. So NGA has this pilot. To your point, I think more companies are starting to create these pathways for folks from this community to make sure that that they haven't. I mean, I think the data, I didn't include it, but the data around autistic individuals, early career folks who are unemployed is very significant. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. You know, even with the folks at NGA, I'll put it in the link. We're doing a symposium tomorrow where we're actually going to have 3 neuroscientists and data scientists talk about this issue. You can register to attend that and other sessions. But some of the main challenges are around security clearance. So, you know, the depths of paperwork, as well as the interview process. You know, investigators are trained to be kind of suspicious of different behaviors. And oftentimes someone who may, you know, may be autistic or have any other type of variation just might not be comfortable in that interview setting. And so lots of other companies, and including NGA as the pilot agency, are changing the interview process. So it's more of a week-long skills-based applied learning interview that circumvents a lot of the triggers or gatekeeping mechanisms that would keep folks out of these types of pathways. And so if there is a role for gaming, wargaming, what is it? And so for us, the easier meaning more quickly implementable approach is just creating a learning environment that can provide, to the extent possible and capable by our organization, it can provide frameworks and a positive learning experience for girls, women, and gender minorities with different needs or different variations with respect to their learning. I think the game itself could be quite interesting. And Sally Davis, I at least read about it. I didn't participate in it, but I had read that she designed a game that simulated the experience of being dyslexic. And so there could just be an opportunity to design games that simulate the experience of someone trying to play a game, you know, if they are autistic or if they do have ADHD, or I even think of trauma as well as another part of kind of simulating that experience. I think designing inclusive games that prioritize different contributions could also be a way to create a sense of belonging and create a sense of space for different types of, all types of learners, not even different types of learners, all types of learners. Yeah, I didn't get to, I really am interested in it. It's on my to-do list, Sally Davis's game. Also designing games to facilitate communication, you know, a lot of, you know, there is a lot of active communication during, you know, breakout groups, but just making sure that that communication, again, is supported by some of these frameworks, having a specialist in the room or having someone who's trained on the team and some of these different frameworks, I think could be really, I just think could be quite impactful for lots of different people, because I think still, you know, there's so many stigmas around any conversation about emotion or empathy or mental health or differences, whatever it may be. I think prioritizing this as part of a gaming experience in a way that's comfortable, of course, for participants is something that could be quite impactful. And then creating opportunities for design to facilitate inclusion. So a lot of the work and conversations that we've had created space for young people to actually design the games themselves, which was great for their fine motor skills and also, you know, great for their focus, and you know, provided a sense of inclusion in the gaming space more broadly. And a couple of organizations, the one called the Games Workshop in the UK, which I feel like they're a bit more advanced in some of this work, actually have workshops for autistic teens to come in and create war games. They actually create the physical game itself, the pieces and the board, which also addresses some of the challenges around like color blindness or you know, sequencing, or just the visuals of a map, you know, different types of things that at least we know from girls in our program distract heavily from what they're able to learn. So I just wanted to flag these 2 resources that we're working on or been following. The first, we're actually working with neuroscientists to implement as part of our programming. The second one, Meeples Like Us, is a UK-based website where they actually have a game recommender, and Memoir of 44 is one that they kind of rank highly for being accessible to lots of different people, although I don't think it's the most exciting one. But they're actually working on tabletop accessibility guidelines. And right now they're at the place where they've, I think, at least sourced people to be involved, but it's, from my understanding, it's quite in its nascency. The universal design guidelines are a tool used in the implementation of universal design for learning, a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. I really like these guidelines because they're very straightforward. They break out kind of the stages of the human experiences as part of an educational setting. They're grounded in science and data. They're kind of evolving. In other words, the guidelines themselves, the organization has created an equity space. So they're actively sourcing new information, new science, new perspectives to continue to kind of push the bar and evolve the understanding of how do we actually make learning and gaming more accessible to more people. And I think that's part of, one of these lessons at Girl Security that we've learned, which is, I think sometimes we get this reaction of like, oh, here we go, it's another framework. But the reality is if you do the work well once and you continue to evolve it, the rest of it, the work itself is rewarding, but then the rest of it, continues to kind of just be this, I think, very collaborative experience around creating accessible games, and other types of programming as well. So at least for us at Girl Security, when we're thinking about both girls and women who are going into the national security space, perhaps future war gamers, and specifically girls who may be self-diagnosing or sharing an identity of ADHD or whatever it may be, we kind of see this as a responsibility that we have to make sure that we're implementing these platforms for them sooner rather than later, and not necessarily to even just keep them in the field, just to make sure that they have a positive experience as part of our program. So that's as much as I am. My vocal cords are wearing out here, but I'm happy to have a conversation about this. As I said, this is a conversation in progress over the next 12 months. We're going to be doing a lot of work in the space of designing games or adapting the games that we've already built, designing new experiences. In addition, we'll be providing trainings for mentors in our program to make sure that they have these frameworks in place as well to support their engagement across populations and at Girl Security. And yeah, I appreciate the time that everybody took to be here today.
Does anyone have any additional questions? I have a comment from Voco. Makes me think Girl Security could mentor its members in war game design beyond just playing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's kind of where I think we're going to go, is create some pilots where they're actually doing the design. And I think, Tim, to your point, we do have both virtual and board. And I think I think with the pandemic, obviously lots was upended for our model, but we have a lot of virtual programming because it allows us to reach more girls and women from diverse communities and create a space for them to participate in these types of experiences. But I think it's no surprise that there's a lot lost in the virtual environment. However, a lot of the teen girls we work with are actually more comfortable using virtual platforms and virtual tools as part of gaming. So I think for us, it's a balance of figuring out how we integrate some of the frameworks and tools that we're developing and learning about into the virtual experience, and leveraging the tools that adolescents are using already in their play and socialization, and finding where that meets in the middle for them so that they have a positive experience.
And I have a personal question. I have not played a lot of games with adolescents other than my younger siblings who let's just say they sometimes are allowed to win. Have you noticed anything with adolescents in particular, or have there just been some like unexpected insights that you've gained from doing war games with them?
Yeah, actually, we had a young girl who was autistic, at least this was one from the program we just did, and she plays Dungeons and Dragons all of the time. And she really appreciated the virtual war game and felt that she actually didn't feel like it was competitive. So I think Tim had asked, she kind of said like, I was sick of the competitive D&D environment, and this actually felt like we were gaming towards something that mattered, and really got a lot out of that program. I think generally speaking, there's always a sense of surprise after they've completed a game. They feel and report, we have surveys and so forth, they feel and report a sense of empowerment. They have a positive experience, even if the content is maybe not comfortable or familiar. If you're talking about, geopolitics or whatever it might be, they're really able to engage as peers in the experience, which I think that's kind of where at Girl Security we've learned to not get too caught up with the content, because oftentimes it's the experience that is more rewarding for them than the actual design of the game or thrust of the game itself. So I think I want to keep doing them. We want to keep doing them because they provide such a positive learning environment for different types of girls from different backgrounds.
Awesome. And Vish is coming to us from the UK, and I think he asked about internationalization in the future.
I mean, I don't know what's in the future. Sometimes I feel like the future is just my hand right in front of my face. I believe so. And we have a lot of actually mentees in the UK. Actually, we did a war game with girls in the UK. It was virtual. And there's we'll be doing a program in Morocco where I actually think we will also do a war game, a 2-day game. And, there's girls and women all over the world who read about the war game that we did and reached out and said, how can I do one of these? We're a startup still. So we're constantly trying to figure out how to make these experiences accessible without hyper local, because we don't want to just like drop in with a US designed war game and assume that that's going to resonate with different populations. So I think to Volko's point, creating a space where we can allow for collaborative design even across multiple regions, I think would be really cool. Yeah, I think so, Volko. I think it would be really cool. Yeah, I mean, it is, because that's kind of what we're, I definitely think there's a role in that. And I think there's, what we know, we've talked to quite a few women in the gaming space as well, is I don't want to over articulate or over, kind of project what I think it is, but there's just a lot of domains where girls are playing right now or existing or socializing that aren't safe for them, and the gaming space being one of them. And so I think especially for girls and women interested in national security, where wargaming can provide, kind of an anchor of interest or an opportunity for new thinking, we're definitely, that's definitely something that's a priority for us as well. I think, probably that, Tim, I don't know that we've had a negative experience, although, like I said, I actually think we created a negative experience for the girls in the war game that I mentioned, where they probably weren't able to benefit as extensively or even more than they did, because we didn't appropriately scaffold the content for them. And so I think that's an experience we really took to heart, that really was important for us to know and to kind of improve our model around wargaming and to make sure it's accessible. But I think for us, it's going to be a constantly evolving process, because I really can't articulate how bad things are right now for teenagers, and how there's so much that not just the education space, the neuroscience space, the health, the mental health space, the everything space, we're just going to be tracking their development, and I think continuously learning more about how we need to, I think, totally disrupt education to support what kids and young people actually need right now. And that's where I do think wargaming can provide a really great intervention. And maybe it's called a conflict simulation. Maybe it's something that's more universal that can be accessed by more people. How do we know when we're hitting the target? You mean with respect to programming or the experience? Yeah, I think generally we feel like we hit the target when we receive feedback that yields or reveals what we hoped participants would get out of it, which is, kind of the kind of strategic and operational and logistical considerations, the experience around a skill set they already have. They just don't know that it's a skill set. So if they can connect the dots with the experience and a skill that they have, we feel like that's pretty successful. I think where we see them build social networks out of the experience is also really successful, because there still are, we have now over 800 mentees in our program from across the country, but there might be one mentee in Alabama, and 50 in Boston. And so when we see them develop a social network out of one of these experiences, we feel that's really wonderful. And we've seen that happen across populations of all different types of girls in our program. And I think it's probably hitting the target when they feel comfortable to tell us what we can do better, which may come as no surprise. Teen girls have zero filter. And so we get a lot of really important criticism or constructive, whatever you want to call it, constructive feedback. I'm totally comfortable with calling it criticism. That really helps, I think, make us improve it. And then they know that their feedback loop is providing a better experience for others. So in the one war game I mentioned, 15 of those participants will actually come back next year and help us run the game for this kind of next cohort of people, which again will offer a really exciting experience for them and us too.
That's awesome. And I agree, Tim. We've had a lot of really great, thoughtful answers. I feel like I'm ready again for my next gaming session with my brother and his teenage friends.
Oh my gosh.
Some of whom are girls and are like, I don't want to play World of Warships. I'm like, it's kind of fun. As somebody who did not want to play a game about World War II warships, it's a fun game.
It is a fun game.
And Volko, I'm not sure what you mean about going through the cycle of a mentee becoming a mentor.
Yeah,
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here. If anybody has additional questions for Lauren, feel free to hang out. We'll be here for a few more minutes.